When I moved into that quiet street, I thought I'd be alone. But the two women next door greeted me with a smile that carried a secret. "We've been waiting," they said. I didn't know then that they meant me. When I first pulled into the driveway of my new place, I thought it would be like every other move I'd made in my life. Quiet, a little lonely, a chance to start over without anyone really noticing. The street was calm, tucked just far enough from the city to feel like its own little world. The air smelled of lilacs and freshly cut grass. I remember thinking I might finally get a bit of peace here. But the moment I stepped out of the truck, I felt their eyes on me. Not in a sharp way, no judgment, but in a way that made me suddenly aware of myself. The way my shirt clung after the long drive. The way I pushed my hair back with one hand as I lifted a box from the back. Across the hedges, two women stood on the porch of the house next door. Both carried themselves with the kind of natural elegance you can't fake. Graceful but grounded, like they belonged to this street as much as the oak trees lining it. One wore her hair loose, streaks of silver woven through dark strands that shimmered in the late light. The other had it tied back, revealing the kind of calm confidence in her face that made you want to lean closer when she spoke. I gave a polite wave, expecting just the usual neighborly nod in return. But instead, they walked down their steps in perfect, unhurried rhythm, almost as if they'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Welcome," one of them said, her voice warm and steady, carrying across the driveway as though it belonged there. The other smiled in a way that made me pause, the kind of smile that felt like it held a secret just out of reach. And then, almost in unison, they said it. "We've been waiting." I froze, a box still in my hands. For a second, I thought I'd misheard, but the playful glint in their eyes told me I hadn't. I managed a nervous laugh, trying not to sound as young as I suddenly felt. "Waiting for me?" I asked, half joking, half hoping for an explanation. They exchanged a glance, quick, subtle, but full of meaning. Then came the second line, softer this time, but even more certain. "Now you belong to us." The words settled into me in a way I couldn't shake, long after they turned back toward their porch. I told myself it was just neighborly friendliness, maybe a teasing way of saying I was part of the block now. But the tone of it, the steadiness in their voices, made it feel like something more. I stood there in the driveway for a long moment, the box growing heavy in my arms, watching as they disappeared back into the glow of their porch light. My heart beat a little faster than it should have. That was the beginning, the moment two neighbors turned a quiet street into a story I never expected to live. The first week in my new house passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and adjusting to the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. But it didn't take long before I noticed a pattern. Those two women next door always seemed to be there. Not in an intrusive way, more like the sun or the moon, appearing naturally, as though they belonged to the background of every day. In the mornings, I'd catch sight of one of them watering the flowers along the white picket fence, a wide-brimmed hat casting shade across her face. She'd wave, sometimes with her gloved hand still dripping from the hose. The other often stepped outside with a mug of coffee, the steam rising into the cool air, her robe loosely tied, hair still damp from a shower. She'd nod in greeting, her eyes lingering just a second longer than a stranger's would. I started to realize how easily their presence folded into my days. When I carried in groceries, they happened to be outside. When I struggled with a loose gate hinge, one of them appeared with a screwdriver already in hand, saying, "Here, try this." It wasn't just neighborly helpfulness. It was attentive, as if they'd been waiting for me to need something. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air smelled of cut grass, I found myself helping them carry boxes from the back of their car. Their hands brushed mine when passing a carton, and though the touch was brief, it left behind a quiet warmth that stayed with me long after. It was in those small exchanges, the press of fingers against my wrist as one thanked me, the quick squeeze of my arm when the other laughed at something I said, that I began to feel the edges of my solitude soften. What unsettled me most wasn't their beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the way they looked at me. Their eyes didn't skim over me the way people often do when you're just another young face in a crowd. No, they looked as if they saw more, as if they noticed the way I hesitated before speaking, the way I carried myself like someone half-rooted, half-searching. One night, I stood on my porch as the cicadas hummed their endless song, watching the two of them walk together down the sidewalk. Their silhouettes moved in easy harmony, steps falling in time, shoulders brushing as though they were sharing a secret conversation. When they spotted me, they lifted their hands in unison, a small gesture that felt larger than it was. I lifted mine back, and for a reason I couldn't explain, my chest tightened. That street was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to be invisible for a while. But instead, I was being noticed, truly noticed, in a way that left me both unsettled and quietly drawn in. By the time I went inside, their laughter still echoing faintly in the summer night, I knew this wasn't going to be just another move. This was something else, something I didn't yet have a name for. It was on a Friday evening when the invitation finally came. I had just finished mowing the lawn, sweat still clinging to the back of my neck, when one of them called across the hedge. "You've been working hard. Come sit with us a while." Her voice carried through the fading light, gentle but steady, the kind that doesn't need repeating. I hesitated for a moment, caught off guard, but the truth was I've been waiting for something like this, an opening, a chance to step into their orbit. Their porch was simple but full of life. Hanging plants swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the wooden boards glowed amber in the last stretch of sunlight. A bottle of wine rested on the table, 3 glasses already waiting as if they had known I'd say yes. I took a seat, and for a moment I was hyper-aware of everything. The scrape of the chair legs on the wood, the way my shirt clung slightly from the heat of the day, the nearness of the two women sitting across from me. They asked about my life first, where I'd come from, what I hoped to find here. Their questions weren't casual. They listened closely, their eyes never drifting away, their expressions shifting with every word I spoke. I found myself telling them more than I intended, about how I'd been restless for years, never quite feeling at home anywhere, about how I wanted quiet, but also connection, though I didn't quite know how to admit that out loud. When I trailed off, embarrassed of my own honesty, one of them reached across the table and touched my hand lightly, the pads of her fingers pressing just enough to steady me. "I know that feeling," she said softly. The other nodded, her voice low and thoughtful. "We've lived whole lives putting others first. Families, careers, expectations. And now, sometimes the nights get too quiet." Her words lingered in the air, heavy but tender. The porch light flicked on above us, and in its glow, I could see the faint vulnerability behind their confident smiles. I sipped from my glass, the wine smooth and warm, and realized this was different from any conversation I'd had in years. It wasn't about small talk or filling silence. It was about being seen, about being understood in ways I hadn't known I was aching for. As the sky deepened into twilight, fireflies began to the yard. Their glow pulsed gently, like distant heartbeats, and the sound of crickets swelled around us. The air was warm, but the closeness of the moment made it warmer still. At one point, one of them leaned closer, her shoulder brushing mine as she reached for the bottle. She didn't pull back quickly, and neither did I. The brief press of her arm against mine sent a quiet shiver through me, not of fear, but of recognition, as though something unspoken had just been acknowledged. By the time I finally stood to leave, the night was thick and humming, and I carried with me not just the taste of wine, but the weight of their voices, their laughter, and the startling comfort of realizing that loneliness isn't always a permanent condition. Sometimes, it's just waiting for the right invitation. A storm rolled in one evening, sudden and heavy, the kind that makes the world pause. I had been sitting in my window, watching the trees bend under the wind, when a knock came at the door. It was them. Both women stood there, damp hair clinging to their temples, laughter spilling out of them as raindrops ran down their coats. "You shouldn't be alone in weather like this," one said with a grin. "Come on, our power's still on. Sit with us a while." I followed them back across the lawn, the rain soaking through my shirt in seconds. Their porch light glowed warmly against the gray sky, and stepping inside felt like crossing into another world, safe, golden, alive. They led me to the living room, where a couch faced tall windows streaked with rain. A blanket was tossed casually across the back, and candles flickered softly in the corners. The storm became a soundtrack, the tap of raindrops, the low rumble of thunder. We sat together on the couch, close enough that our knees brushed when we shifted. At first, I tried to keep my body still, afraid of crowding the space. But they didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't mind. One of them leaned forward, tucking her feet beneath her, the curve of her shoulder resting lightly against mine. The other reached for the blanket and, without asking, spread it across all three of us in one gentle motion. Her hand grazed my chest as she adjusted the fabric, her fingers lingering just a second too long. The touch was innocent, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I swallowed, my pulse quickening, though I kept my eyes fixed on the storm outside, as if it could steady me. The room grew quieter as the evening settled. Conversation drifted into stories, childhood memories, travels, the little habits they'd picked up from each other after years of living side by side. I laughed more than I expected to, and in those pauses between laughter, I felt the nearness of them in every breath, every shift of weight against the couch cushions. At one point, lightning flashed, and instinctively, one of them reached for me. Her fingers found my wrist, holding lightly, grounding herself against the rumble of thunder. She didn't let go right away, and when she finally did, her hand slipped away slowly, as though reluctant to break the contact. The three of us sat there for what felt like hours, wrapped in warmth while the storm raged outside. Their perfume mixed with the scent of rain drifting in through a cracked window. I could feel their breaths, soft and steady, syncing with mine. It wasn't a grand moment, not something that would stand out to anyone else. But for me, it was everything, the first true closeness. Not in words, but in the simple weight of shoulders pressing together, in the brush of a hand across my arm, in the silence that no longer felt empty. That night, I realized something had shifted. Whatever was happening between us wasn't accidental. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the air heavy and sweet, the kind of air that clings to your skin. But the closeness from the night before didn't leave so easily. I carried it with me. Every glance, every accidental touch replayed in my head like a secret I wasn't sure I was allowed to keep. For days, I tried to convince myself it was just kindness. They were older, wiser, generous with their attention. I was probably reading too much into things. But then came the evening when the silence between us grew too thick to ignore. We were back on their porch, the three of us. The sunset spilled gold across the boards, and the hum of cicadas wrapped around us like a blanket. I could feel the words pushing in my chest, fighting to get out. My hands tightened around my glass, my voice unsteady when I finally spoke. "I need to ask you something," I said. My tone surprised even me, softer, more raw than I intended. Both women turned toward me, their expressions open, patient. The one nearest to me tilted her head just slightly, her hair brushing her shoulder, waiting. "I don't want to misread things," I admitted, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I feel drawn to you both, more than I should be, and I know I'm younger, and maybe that makes this complicated." The words came out in fragments, but once spoken, I couldn't take them back. My chest felt tight, my palms damp. I braced myself for polite laughter, for gentle dismissal. Instead, there was only stillness. And then a hand. One of them reached up, cupping my cheek with a tenderness that made my throat ache. Her thumb brushed across my jaw, slow, steady, as if reminding me to breathe. "You don't have to be afraid of what you feel," she whispered. Her eyes, clear in the fading light, held none of the judgment I had feared, only recognition. The other placed her hand over mine where it rested on the armrest, her palm warm, fingers curling until they wove through mine. "We've noticed," she said gently, "the way you listen, the way you look at us, not with pity, not with assumptions, just with sincerity." Her hand squeezed mine softly, grounding me. "This isn't about age. It's about connection. And we feel it too." The air thickened around us, but not with fear, rather with a fragile kind of relief, the kind that follows a truth finally spoken. For a moment, All I could do was sit there, caught between their touch, the soft brush of fingers at my cheek, the steady weight of a hand over mine. My heart beat hard enough that I was certain they could hear it. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, a reminder of the storm that had passed, but also of the one we were standing in now. A storm of emotions, of possibilities, of risks. I swallowed hard, my voice breaking when I finally whispered, "Then what happens now?" They exchanged a glance, one of those wordless conversations they seemed to share so easily. And then, almost together, they answered, not with certainty, but with quiet conviction. "Now," one said, her hand still against my face, "we see where this takes us." After that night on the porch, something shifted between us. Not in loud ways, not in sudden gestures, but in the quiet certainty that we all finally understood. The unspoken had been spoken, and the space between us was no longer filled with hesitation, but with possibility. The following evening, they invited me inside again. The house was dimly lit, candles glowing on the mantel, their flickering light softening every corner. I sat between them on the couch, the same couch where the storm had once forced us together. But this time, there was no storm, only the stillness of a summer night, thick with cicadas and the faint hum of air through an open window. We talked in low voices, the kind of conversation that drifts more than it presses. Every now and then, laughter bubbled up, warm and unforced, until it faded back into a silence that didn't need to be filled. And then came the moment when words no longer mattered. One of them shifted closer, her knee brushing mine. She let it linger, watching my face carefully. When I didn't move away, she leaned in just slightly, resting her head against my shoulder. Her hair smelled faintly of lavender, soft strands tickling against my neck. On my other side, the second woman moved just as naturally, sliding nearer until her hip pressed against mine. Her hand found my forearm, resting there with a quiet firmness, as if anchoring me to the space we now shared. I felt held, not in a dramatic embrace, but in a way far more powerful. Their closeness wrapped around me like a cocoon, safe and steady. I could feel the rhythm of their breathing, one against my shoulder, the other against my side, and without trying, my own breath fell into sync with theirs. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was drifting. I didn't feel younger or older, inadequate or uncertain. I simply felt wanted. At some point, one of them whispered, her voice barely louder than the cicadas outside, "Do you understand now? When we said you belonged to us." The words sent a shiver through me. Not of fear, but of recognition. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see both of their faces in the candlelight, the softness of their smiles, the quiet steadiness in their eyes. "I do," I murmur, my voice catching. "I think I do." Their arms moved almost at the same time, one looping gently around my waist, the other curling against my chest. It was a shared embrace, deliberate yet unhurried, as if they'd been waiting for me to be ready. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of them sink into me. The quiet beat of their hearts pressed against me on both sides, steady, sure. And in that moment, all the doubts, all the restless searching that had led me here, finally gave way to something I had been chasing without knowing it, belonging. They didn't need to say anything more. Neither did I. The silence, the closeness, the simple act of breathing together was enough. That night, I stopped wondering if I was out of place in their lives. Because in their arms, I had never felt more at home. The days that followed felt different, though nothing about the neighborhood itself had changed. The trees still whispered in the breeze. The mail still arrived with a dull thud in the box. The cicadas still sang their endless song at dusk. Yet every routine moment carried a new undercurrent, a quiet certainty that I wasn't alone anymore. Each morning, I found myself naturally drifting to their porch with a cup of coffee in hand. Sometimes they were already there, waiting with their own mugs, steam curling into the cool air. Sometimes I arrived first, and the sound of the screen door opening behind me told me they were close. We didn't always talk. Often we just sat together, shoulders nearly touching, watching the sunlight creep across the garden. Evenings became ours as well. We shared dinners, Simple meals that tasted richer simply because of the company. One would cook, the other would set the table, and I would hover in the middle, helping wherever I could. I'd catch them exchanging little smiles when I carried a dish to the table or refilled their glasses, as if my presence filled a space they'd quietly kept open. The affection between us wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was in the way one of them brushed a stray leaf from my shoulder when we worked in the garden, in the way the other rested her hand lightly against the small of my back as we walked inside at night. Small touches, simple gestures, yet each one carried more meaning than I could have imagined. One night, as we sat together in the fading light, I realized how naturally it had all fallen into place. There was no need to ask what we were, no urgency to define it. The answer was already in the rhythm of our days, in the comfort of their nearness, in the way my heart no longer ached with restlessness. I remember that evening clearly, the golden glow over their yard, the soft clink of our cups as we set them down, the chorus of crickets singing around us. One of them leaned over, resting her head lightly on my shoulder. The other reached for my hand, her fingers weaving through mine. Neither said a word, but in that silence, I felt something stronger than any declaration. I belonged, not because they had claimed me, not because of some fleeting spark, but because together we had built something steady, something real. Looking at them, two women who carried both strength and vulnerability with such grace, I felt an ache of gratitude rise in my chest. I thought of the first day, of their words, "We've been waiting. Now you belong to us." At the time, I hadn't understood. Now, sitting there with their warmth pressed against me, I finally did. Belonging wasn't something you stumbled into. It was something you recognized when the right arms finally wrapped around you, when the right voices made you feel heard, when the quiet spaces in your heart stopped echoing. And as the evening faded into night, their smiles, soft, sure, and deeply content, told me what I needed to know. I was home. With them.